Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our weekly Chats on the Past program, where the museum discusses history with scholars, authors, historians, and artisans. My name is Nicole Carpenter, and I am the Director of Programs and Education at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. As usual, we are pleased to offer you this program for free, but we do always ask that you support the museum however you can. We do have a suggested donation of $5, but we understand this is a difficult time. Another way that we would love for you to support the museum is by liking and following us on our social media accounts. On Facebook and Twitter, you can follow us at Westport History, and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. If at any point during our program you have any questions or a comment, a story, an anecdote that you would like to share, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A box. I will be monitoring these during our discussion, and we will go over as many of them as we can at the end of our program tonight. This evening, I am joined by Professor Walter Woodward, who's a scholar of early American and Atlantic world history with an emphasis on Connecticut and New England. His research interests cover a variety of subjects, including witchcraft, which I find endlessly fascinating, alchemy, the story of the history of science, as well as music in early America, as well as environmental history. Professor Woodward has earned his PhD from UConn in 2001 and has served as Connecticut State Historian since 2014. In addition to being a historian, he had successful careers in music and advertising. And tonight he is joining me to discuss his new book, Creating Connecticut, Critical Moments That Shaped a Great State. So welcome, Walter.
Hi, thank you, Nicole. And thank everyone who is taking the time on this wonderful, it's very nice up here, Friday night. I'm up in Columbia, and I know the temptation to be maybe out on the patio with a cocktail at 5 o'clock is a pretty big one. So any of you who are here, thank you so much for coming. I am excited to share with you the news about or stories from my new book, Creating Connecticut. And this is a book I have a real fondness for because it's one that I wrote very intentionally, both as a historian and a historian who serves the public. As an academic historian, I think many of the books that we write, they're very dense, they're very thoughtful, they're very considered, but ordinary people reading many of the histories that people in the academy write find them dense and a little, a little unapproachable. Well, this book is intended to be something different, a book about Connecticut history, which is my portfolio, that is enjoyable and readable. And I thought when I came to introduce the book, I was thinking, how am I going to tell people about this book? And I thought back to my very first graduate seminar. And I had, this was when I was becoming a professional historian. And I had this wonderful kind of dour, distinguished professor. I mean, he is a distinguished professor at the University of Connecticut. His name is Richard D. Brown. And this was my first graduate seminar. And I hadn't realized till I got into the program that when you decide to become a professional historian, you start drinking history like you're drinking water out of a fire hose. You get a book in every course every week and many articles, and you're just reading all the time. And it's crazy. And we would go into his seminars, and for 15 weeks, he would begin every seminar with the same question. Why did the author write this book? First time that he asked that question, I was gonna, it was just completely nonplussed because I'd never thought about that. But as we would spend 3 hours then unpacking why the author had written the book, at least what we thought that was. And I came to realize that that's really an important question. What is it about a subject that makes an author think it's worth several years of his or her time to put down on paper? And then why does he think that, he or she, why do they think that whatever they've written is worth several days or hours of your time to read it? So by way of introduction, I thought that what I would do is answer for you the question that Dick Brown taught us to answer in that very first seminar. And I put that in the introduction of my book, and that's what I'm going to share with you now, with your permission, why I wrote this book. As Connecticut State Historian, I've had the good fortune to spend my career focusing my historical research on this state, its people, and their stories. Creating Connecticut is a product of that effort. It's a collection of 24 stories, 12 shorter, 12 longer, each of which tells us something important about Connecticut's past, something that still, in one way or another, affects our lives as Connecticutans today. All of them are designed to be readable, engaging, and informative introductions to aspects of Connecticut's history that will be new or nearly so to most readers. Some of the stories in Creating Connecticut show people we thought we knew, like Mark Twain and Nathan Hale, in new and surprising ways. Some tell us about people many of us don't know, Eleazar Wheelock, Samson Occam, Adrian Block, but maybe we ought to. And many are about events, movements, and periods of change. The Pequot War, the Hartford Witch Hunt, out-migration to Connecticut's Western Reserve, Irish migration into the state. Crucial moments when Connecticut's were tested and called on by circumstances to change their minds, values, approaches, and even lives. Moments just like the one we're living through now. And some of the stories are also about the uniqueness of our state and the ways in which Connecticutans have celebrated their past in the past. The focus here is on stories that both interest and matter. You can read them from front to back. They're arranged more or less in chronological order, or you can scan the table of contents and just jump in with the story that seems most interesting to you. My hope in writing this book and my hope in making this presentation tonight is that you'll read Creating Connecticut and you'll come away with a desire to know more about Connecticut history. So what I'd like to do with the rest of my talk is read passages from a few of the stories in Creating Connecticut. Then I'll answer any questions you may have. Feel free to type them in the chat box as we go along. And finally, I will tell you how you can get your own signed copy of this rare literary gem. At least that's what my wife tells me it is. And I'll begin with a reading from Creating Connecticut's first story about Connecticut's restless beginnings and the 50 years of conflict between the Dutch and English and the indigenous people of this state, a restless era that is today an all but forgotten part of our history. That story begins on a day in the year 1614. In the spring of 1614, Adrian Block sailed the little ship he had built and named Onrust, Restlessness, into the river the Algonquians called Connecticut, or the place of the long water. The 47-year-old Dutchman was as restless as his vessel and anxious to make up the losses he had experienced the previous winter when his ship Tiger had accidentally burned to the waterline at Manhattan. The trader and explorer was anxious too to secure the Dutch government's recent promise of a trading monopoly over any new countries or harbors discovered by Dutch explorers. Restless to turn his fortunes around, Block came up a river that was itself restless, running fresh and full of upriver snowmelt and spring rain. He named the river the Versha, meaning fresh, as in fast running. And as the first known European to probe its courses and seek its opportunities, he launched an era of restlessness that would change this river and its people forever. Then as now, restless had many meanings, and all would apply to the world the arrival of this little boat would create. A generation of restless Europeans, both Dutch and English, constantly in motion, never ceasing or pausing, would come to the Connecticut, the place of the long water, first in search of trade with the indigenous people, and soon after in quest of those people's lands and resources. Some of them were spiritually restless, troubled in mind and soul, and seeking a place to serve their God as their consciences demanded. For the Native Americans already here, the arrival of the onrust heralded a new restlessness. First, as they jostled to control distribution of European trade goods, and later, as they fought the incoming insurgents' efforts to take their lands and control their lives. For Connecticut's first peoples, the arrival of the onrust brought centuries of restlessness, literal unrest, sleepless worry, sickness, turmoil, and death. Time is the acid rain of historical memory. Slowly, often over generations, stretching into centuries, important details of the past can fade one by one until what was once crucial to the life of a time and people is all but forgotten. So it has been with the Dutch history of Connecticut. Most school children are still taught that the first European to come to Connecticut was Adrian Block. And many students of Hartford history know the Dutch had a trading house there, somewhere close to the later site of Samuel Colt's arms manufacturing complex. But for the average Connecticut, that's the sum of it. The English arrived and the Dutch faded to black. The rest of the colonial story, as they remember it, is a simplistic tale of English versus Indians that quickly morphs into one about patriots versus Tories. But that's not how it was. For its first 50 years, Connecticut was a restless, seething site of constant competition, pitting nation against nation, tribe against tribe, and colonies against colonies in a Rubik's Cube of combinations that always involved the Dutch. Nothing was done by the English at Connecticut without first calculating the Dutch response in New Netherland or at the States General, the seat of government in The Hague. No English settlement was expanded, no tribal alliance contracted, no trading venture launched without calculating the Dutch reaction. The Dutch Connecticut story was a deeply conflicted, sometimes harrowing experience. Those who lived in that time knew their lives depended on knowing it in detail. Now, I go on in this chapter to highlight the nearly continuous state of conflict between the various English plantations, Dutch authorities, and Indian communities, and the shifting alliances that made life a restless and fearful struggle for everyone in Connecticut's first half century. It was a restless era that set the stage for much that came later, including Connecticut's unique history of witch hunting. And in another chapter, I try to answer many of the questions that history raises. Connecticut's record in handling witchcraft cases raises many questions. Some are unique to Connecticut, some apply to all witch hunts. Why, for example, in the early years of witch hunting, 1647 to 1663, was Connecticut New England's fiercest prosecutor of witches? And why did it switch from being the region's greatest witch killer to the colony that ended executions permanently a generation before Salem? Why did people even believe in witchcraft? What exactly did people think witches could do? And why did it scare them? Why were most witches women? And what made someone who had been a neighbor for many years suddenly so dangerous that community safety made executing them mandatory? The answer to those questions began not in Connecticut, but in Europe. And in the chapter, I trace the Renaissance history of witch hunting, explain the magical worldview that made such hunts possible, and discuss the English witch hunts that were peaking when the Puritans emigrated to Connecticut. The Puritans who came to New England in the early decades of the 1600s carried their fear of the devil and his minions to New England, along with their Bibles, clothing, and seed stock. England's greatest witch hunt took place between 1644 and 1647 in the Puritan counties of East Anglia. There, a man named Matthew Hopkins, who styled himself England's witch-finder general, led a witch hunt that resulted in many executions. Some people say as many as 300 people. The East Anglian location of Hopkins' witch hunt is significant. That's the place from which many of Connecticut's early settlers emigrated. They knew much about, and some had direct connections to, the Hopkins trials. Many must have feared that if the devil was assaulting the English Puritans this furiously in East Anglia, it was only a matter of time until he would find his way to New England. It's not surprising, therefore, that New England's first execution for witchcraft took place in 1647, just as the witch hunt in England was winding down. Perhaps the most interesting thing about this first New England witch death is that we wouldn't know anything about it, except for 2 sentences that appeared in 2 different documents produced 100 miles away from each other and found some 250 years apart. Sometime between March and May of 1647, Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop, whose History Journal of New England is one of our most important historical sources from the period, wrote in that journal the following sentence: "One," and he left a blank, "of Windsor, arraigned and executed at Hartford for a witch." Winthrop left the blank space, intending, no doubt, to add the witch's name once he'd received further information. But for the next 257 years, that's all that was known. Some person who lived in Windsor was tried for witchcraft in Hartford and then executed. What was she charged with? Who conducted her trial? Who testified against her? What was her defense? Where was she hanged? None of this was known. In truth, historians did not even know whether New England's first convicted witch was a man or a woman. Then, in 1904, Annie Eliot Trumbull, daughter of Connecticut's first state librarian, J. Hammond Trumbull, announced that she had come into possession of a little old volume with a worn sheepskin binding that contained the manuscript diary of Matthew Grant, a resident of Windsor from 1635 to 1681. In it, she reported, she had found a Grant-penned entry stating that on May 26, 1647, Alice Young was hanged. Finally, after 2.5 centuries, it was confirmed that New England's first executed witch was, as supposed, a woman, and that her name was Alice Young. That remains most of what is known for certain about her, though historian Richard Ross has recently argued that Alice emigrated to Windsor from London in 1640, which may have put her culturally at odds with her Windsor neighbors, most of whom had emigrated from the English West Country. Those cultural differences made her an outsider, he speculates, which, when combined with an epidemic of deadly influenza that hit Windsor the year of Young's execution, may have factored in her being singled out for prosecution. Now, the chapter goes on to detail Connecticut's record as early New England's fiercest prosecutor of witchcraft, and how one man, Governor John Winthrop Jr., himself an alchemist and magic practitioner, intervened to bring witch executions in Connecticut to an end. It's a powerful story, I think, with a message as important as any from the better-known Salem trials, and I think you'd enjoy it. Now, for the past decade, many Connecticutans, and especially our younger generation, have left our state to seek their fortunes elsewhere. This is truly troublesome, but it's not the first time it's happened. In another chapter, I tell the story of the great outflux of young Connecticutans in the early 1800s, as the dream or necessity of finding a better life took them to a part of Ohio known as the Connecticut Western Reserve. Here are a few passages that talk about their journeys west and their feelings about leaving. Connecticut in the early 19th century, as in the 21st century, was hemorrhaging its young people, the lifeblood of its future, to other more economically attractive locations. And it had been doing so for a long time. Although they dispersed to sites both far and near, one area in particular proved the most powerful magnet for Connecticut expatriates. This was the part of Northeast Ohio, stretching 120 miles west from the Pennsylvania border, a place many people called New Connecticut, but which was also known and is today still called the Connecticut Western Reserve. This was a part of its original territory that Connecticut reserved ownership of when it ceded the remainder of its charter lands to the newly formed United States in 1786. The journey west was both long and hard, between 500 and 650 miles, depending on the route selected and the destination. Road conditions ranged from very bad to deplorable for most of the journey. In heavy rains, roads became mud pits and streams impassable. In some low-lying or wetland areas, efforts were made to ameliorate the muddy conditions by building corduroy roads of logs placed perpendicular to the direction of travel, which provided their own unique kind of jarring discomfort. It was an experience no traveler would ever forget. In addition to the considerable physical dangers of traveling bad roads, fording swelled streams and rivers, and climbing and descending high mountain passes, migrants commonly experienced inhospitable treatment at overcrowded and often squalid inns and taverns. They slept fitfully among strangers, ate bad food with rowdy, drunken, and sometimes dangerous fellow migrants, and they fought off both homesickness and fear of the unknown. How did all these migrants feel about pulling up roots and leaving their native state? Some undoubtedly felt a pioneer's excitement at facing a world that was all possibility. Others, perhaps the younger sons not in line to inherit the family farm, seethed with resentment about being forced into exile. Some, it is clear, saw having to leave Connecticut for the West as a sign of shame, a visible symbol that they were the expendable ones. How else can we explain Margaret Van Horn Dwight's comment on day 2 of her journey? The country we pass through till we are beyond New York, I need not describe to you, nor indeed could I, for I am attended by a very unpleasant, though not uncommon companion, one to whom I have bowed in subjection ever since I left you, pride. It has entirely prevented me seeing the country lest I should be known. And so I suppose it will attend me to the mountains, then I'm sure it will bid me adieu. Hiding in the wagon so she wouldn't be recognized. This is an aspect about migration that we rarely encounter or even think about. But once we do, it complicates long-standing views of Anglos hot in the pursuit of manifest destiny. Surely, Connecticutans left their state with mixed emotions. Even as young Connecticutans were moving out of the state, others were moving in. Connecticut had found its future in harnessing its abundant water power to drive the factories of the Industrial Revolution. And that created an unprecedented need for workers to build a new kind of infrastructure. The Irish in Connecticut chapter covers nearly 350 years of the Irish story here. But I'd like to present 3 snapshots. One of what it was like for the Irish who arrived in Connecticut just before the potato famine of the mid-1840s, then flash forward to talk about what life was like for their children and grandchildren 50 years later, and then come right up to today and talk about what it means to be Irish in Connecticut now. So here we go. Enter the Irish. To meet the need for laborers, contractors for the Farmington Canal brought in 28 gangs of Irish canal workers called navvies from Galway and Cork. Hartford brought in 400 Irishmen for the Enfield Canal project. Life for the navvies was hellish. Like the Irish railroad track workers who soon followed them, they dug furiously sun up to sunset, goaded by overseer contractors whose profits depended on how much labor they could extract every day. Eyewitnesses marveled at the physical prowess of the Irishmen as they ran full wheelbarrows up narrow planks from ditches 20 feet deep. They lived in temporary shanty camps where overcrowding, poor sanitation, and stagnant water made disease a constant. Alcohol was woven into a workday marked by short bursts of furious digging, followed by a trip to the whiskey barrel and a dram from the jigger boss. Irish workers were paid only for the day's weather and their health let them work, and they earned just 75 cents a day, 1/3 less than native-born laborers. The navvies represented Connecticut's first major influx of practicing Irish Catholics, and the descendants of Connecticut's Puritan founders didn't like it one bit. Connecticut had no resident priest, and the Yankees made it clear they would like to keep it that way. When Reverend John Powers of New York requested permission to celebrate Mass for canal workers at New Haven's Protestant Seamen's Chapel on Long Wharf, he was told, "We have no popery in New Haven, and we don't want any." Despite this overt intolerance, popery did come to Connecticut, at first through the services of an itinerant priest from Rhode Island, who in 1828 conducted house masses on the east bank of the river in Hartford. The following year, Hartford became home to Most Holy Trinity, Connecticut's first Catholic church, and the local paper, the Connecticut Observer, was aghast. How will it read in history that in 1829, Hartford in the state of Connecticut was made the center of a Roman Catholic mission? Now let's jump forward 50 years and see how the children and grandchildren of those unwanted Irish immigrants are faring. Unlike their fathers, by 1900, 2/3 of second-generation Irishmen worked in skilled trades or higher, with economic security mirroring that of the Connecticut Yankees. Irish American men dominated police and fire departments and monopolized the building trades. And while 90% of their mothers remained domestic servants, second-generation Irish American daughters rose to become clerks, skilled factory workers, teachers, and union organizers too. Better jobs came in part because of high Irish involvement in Connecticut's labor movement. Irish Americans made up most of many unions' membership and leadership. And now let's jump forward and have a look at being Irish today. To be Irish in Connecticut today is for those lucky enough to claim Irish American ancestry, a source of both identity and pride, underscored by an extraordinary long-term record of Irish Connecticutans' achievements in politics, law, public safety, commerce, industry, and culture. The fact that such achievements were made by a people once reviled as incapable, discriminated against as inferior, and treated as unwelcome interlopers in a society that took offense at their very presence is an important reminder, especially in times like these, that the very people we fear at one moment can sometimes turn out to be the source of some of our society's greatest strengths. The Irish in Connecticut. Connecticut's most important cultural icon, and we're home to many, is the Gilded Age author and satirist Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. His historic home in Hartford is also one of the country's great historic landmarks. In Mark Twain and the Historic House Problem, I come right out and ask the question I think almost everyone thinks about when they visit the house of this great man, but maybe they keep it to themselves. And that question is this one: why can't I smell smoke? Twain was no ordinary smoker. He was a deeply committed, unregenerate, professional pipe and cigar smoker who mastered his craft at an early age and continued to improve upon it for the next 68 years. In the great age of industrial production, Twain turned himself into a literary factory, belching cigar smoke as the words poured forth. Wherever Twain went, tobacco smoke followed, and one of his greatest fears was to be where tobacco wasn't. In 1867, one day before sailing to Honolulu from British Columbia, Twain found a local wholesale tobacconist, and he brought 3,000 cheroots, those are small cigars, and 15 pounds of tobacco. That was about one cigar per nautical mile of the impending voyage. Later that afternoon, he went back and bought 3,000 more cheroots. That night, shortly after beginning a farewell public lecture, Twain stopped his talk in midstream. He called his manager up to the stage and he said, "Pond, I fear that cigar place may close before I get through here. Go there now and get 1,500 more of those cheroots." In the morning, Twain, his 7,500 cigars, plus his tobacco, happily embarked for the Sandwich Islands. Now, Twain knew smoking was generally unhealthy, but he saw the habit as a kind of life vest that provided a wellness safety margin. He told the story of the doctor who visited an 80-year-old woman who was in rapidly failing health. "You must stop drinking," the doctor told her. "I've never touched a drop of alcohol in my life," she answered. "Well then, you must immediately give up smoking," the doctor said. "I have never, ever smoked," she said indignantly. "Well then," the doctor replied, "there's no way I can help you. You are a sinking ship with no freight to throw overboard." I suspect most people would agree that elections in recent years, at least some of them, have left people on both sides of the political aisle with a bad taste in their mouths. That's why it might be time to revive one of our state's oldest and for centuries most time-honored traditions, the Connecticut election cake. What's an election cake and why is it a Connecticut tradition? An election cake was a big, rich fruit, spice, and sugar yeast cake baked up in huge quantities and served to all comers during the festivities surrounding first our colonies and later our state's annual elections. The story of how election cake became a Connecticut tradition goes all the way back to the days of the Puritans. One of the things that made the Puritans so pure was that they didn't believe in the annual round of Catholic and Anglican holidays. They didn't celebrate Christmas or Easter or any of the numerous saints and festival days, and for them, New Year's Day came on March 26th, so no midnight kisses or dropping ball either. Now, while they rejected all these supposedly invented occasions for mirth, they did believe that in the year 1662, Connecticut, for reasons still not exactly clear, got something that very much was worth celebrating, a royal charter from King Charles II that gave the Connecticut colony virtual independence more than a century before the American Revolution. Unlike Massachusetts and Virginia and the other royally governed American colonies, Connecticut could make its own laws and, more important, elect its own leaders without royal oversight. This right to choose their own leaders was seen from the start as fundamentally important and distinctive, worth celebrating and worth protecting. So it's not surprising that on those days when Connecticutans gathered to choose their leaders, back then election day took place in early May, these otherwise celebration-starved Puritans found reason to celebrate. And what better way to do so than with cake, and lots of it. We know Connecticutans were feasting on election day cakes well before the American Revolution because the colonial records tell us so. And if incorporating election cake into the ceremonies was an important Connecticut tradition before the American Revolution, it became even more important after. As Connecticutans themselves spread across the country to the new lands in the American West, the election cake tradition went with them. Election cake recipes appear in the early cookbooks in states all across the nation, and they are abundantly found in the manuscript cookbooks left by individuals in our historical societies and archives. Reading these works, a few things become crystal clear. Election cakes were central to the election rituals in many places, but especially here in Connecticut. And making an extraordinary election cake, perhaps with one's own special ingredient or unique mixing process, became a point of honor with many homekeepers. Having a reputation for making delicious election cakes became a competitive source of status. During the 1800s, as Connecticut industrialized, welcomed people from many new nations, broke its official ties to the old Puritan church, and experienced the sectional divide that led to the American Civil War, some of Connecticut's time-honored election day traditions, riding out to meet the new governor as he made his way into the Capitol, and parading behind the state's ministers to hear an election sermon in the First Congregational Church. These fell by the wayside, but the election cake remained a steady and a delicious habit. When the General Assembly decided, finally in 1876, to change the start of its sessions from May to early January, beginning the next year, a journalist lamenting the switch of Election Day to midwinter said, "The coming election parade of May 1876 is likely to be the last that will take place in Connecticut. Though the sermon has gone out, though the parade is going out, though the whole institution may become an element of the past, one feature of it will always remain, and that is the election cake. Lovers of it, when it is just right, say no other cake equals it. It is only necessary to add that nobody can make it but an old Connecticut housekeeper, and that each housekeeper and her circle of adherents know that she can make it a good deal better than any of her rivals." So perhaps this is exactly the right time for the Connecticut election cake to make its comeback. At this moment when American politics seems so divisive and so bitter, wouldn't it be great if a cohort of culinary Connecticutans, men and women equally this time, joined together to use their ovens to remind people that democracy, the right to choose the people who rule your government, is a sweet privilege indeed. And what better way could there be to celebrate sweet democracy than to bring back the tradition of the Connecticut election cake? Now, I have included, because I'm taking this seriously and I want people to actually do this, I have put in the back of the book, or at the back of the chapter, a modern election cake recipe. We've done the ingredients as they would be today, and the directions are ones you can follow now. And I truly hope that men and women across the state will decide that they want to pick up this idea of sweet democracy and help, maybe food is such a wonderful thing for bringing people together. And maybe we can use an old Connecticut tradition to heal some of the divisiveness in our modern politics. I hope you'll think about it. You know what? If you're not going to get the book, if you're just interested in the recipe, I give my email address at the end of the talk. Please write it down, send me an email, and I will send you the recipe, because I would love to see this happen. So anyway, that's an overview of some of the 24 stories in Creating Connecticut. And I have to say, it's only a sampler. In addition, there are stories on the rough justice meted out by the British to Connecticut State hero, Nathan Hale. There's a recounting of 1935's Pull Out All the Stops 300th anniversary of Connecticut's founding. The inspiring 275-year-old story of the Lyman family's Whatever It Takes devotion to make and keep Lyman orchards a thriving Connecticut farm. A story about the Puritans' only art form, gravestone carving. A profile of Irish-born Governor John Dempsey, the only immigrant governor of Connecticut since the colonial era, and a meditation on just what it is that makes Connecticut such a unique state. And I close with a very personal story about what it feels like to have late in life realized the childhood dream of owning a house and living in a house that was built by your sixth great grandfather. That's where I am talking to you from tonight, and I have to tell you, it is the best place I've ever lived in, and it's one of the nicest things that's ever happened to me. So, I hope that this introduction to Creating Connecticut has whetted your appetite, and that you will go to your library, order the book online, borrow it from somebody else, but that you will get a chance to read Creating Connecticut and let me know what you think about it. And if you would like to get a signed copy of the book, if you will send me a check for $25, or you can call me or email me, and I can take credit cards, no problem. I will sign the book with the inscription you'd like, and we'll send it out to you and get it in your hands as quickly as possible. The most important thing is that you read Creating Connecticut. It's my mission as state historian, and it's something I truly believe in. If there is anything that the coronavirus so far has underscored for us, we may not really think about this, but it's how important decisions made at the state level are in affecting our lives every day. All of the important decisions about how Connecticut and Connecticutans have handled this virus have come not from Washington, but from the state itself. And our success so far in handling this has happened at the state level. What happens close to home shapes how you think and what you do. And that's why I wrote Creating Connecticut, to get you as excited as I am about this state and its history. And I'll stop right there. I'm going to turn the screen back over to Nicole, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have about what you've heard so far. And thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Walter. That was wonderful. So we do have a couple of questions from our audience. The first is, what is your favorite period, person, or topic to research and write about?
That's a great question. I was trained as a colonial historian. So the early period, this time when so many cultures came together in Connecticut and in the New World in such a conflicted way. And we know the outcome of the story, but we don't realize until you get into the nitty-gritty and realize just how contingent the fate, how things could have turned on a dime every step of the way. So I love that early period. And I wrote a book about John Winthrop Jr., this alchemist who was the man instrumental in stopping the Connecticut witchcraft trials. So I guess if there was one person in Connecticut history I would like to meet, it'd be him. I'd like to sit down and say, when I wrote the book, I thought I figured you out pretty well. Now I want to know if you are actually the person I think you are. The only other thing I would say is this, very quickly. As state historian, my portfolio, my mission is to cover every aspect of this state's history. And there is not one thing I have ever researched in the state at any time period, anywhere, that didn't become fascinating once you start to look at how it happened. So if it can be what happened at the State House yesterday, or what happened in Westport in 1645, I'm in.
Actually, our next question kind of segues into that really beautifully, that colonial period and Winthrop Jr. Someone wants to know what your thoughts on the witch trials in Fairfield that took place after Salem are.
Well, thank you for asking that question. I will tell you, those trials involved indirectly a person who was very much involved in what I think is the most important witchcraft trial in Connecticut. Now, the Fairfield trials of 1692, which I assume are the ones you're talking about, during the Salem witch hunt that happened, a generation after witch execution ended in Connecticut. There were 2 trials for witchcraft in Connecticut, and I can't remember right now whether one or both of the witches were convicted. But in one of the cases, Gershom Bulkley, who was a minister instrumental in ending the witch trials in the 1660s, wrote a letter in defense of one of the accused witches who had been a servant in his household. And he essentially read the people at the trial the riot act for accusing her. They didn't seem to appreciate it much, and I believe she was convicted. There were convictions in the Fairfield cases, and the witches would have hanged, but as had happened in the 1660s, the court set these convictions aside and the witches were not hanged, kind of following a precedent that had been set in the 1660s. I think Connecticut got caught up for a very brief time in the 1690s in that Salem fervor. It seemed like the devil was at work in New England, but as had happened a generation earlier, cooler heads prevailed.
Very luckily for Connecticut too. We would
Especially
love
for
to.
the accused.
Yes, we would love to host you again, Walter, towards the fall to discuss more about the witches. It's a period that we find extremely interesting in Westport, which used to be a part of Fairfield. So we would love to invite you back and pick into that topic a little bit more.
Well, that's a topic I have studied a great deal and I enjoy talking about a lot. So I would love to come back either virtually or actually in 3 dimensions. How strange would that be?
So our next question is there one particular event or figure that you think of as quintessentially Connecticut? And if you do have one person or event that you can think of, what is it?
Oh, I think that's the best question. And believe it or not, I've never been asked that question. I've never thought about it that way. The quintessential Connecticut person or event. In some ways, I think it is the 1935 celebration of the 300th anniversary of the founding of Connecticut. And why that is so quintessentially Connecticut is because in some ways it was a great celebration of the Puritan past. And to tell you this was the biggest event in Connecticut's history is understatement. It went on for 10 months. It involved, they say that at various times, every person in the state was involved in one form or another of the activities, the hundreds and hundreds of activities that were part of this celebration. They ranged from having a symphony called the Connecticut Symphony, composed by the most popular composer of the day, to the largest parade Connecticut had ever had in its history in downtown Hartford, one that I think it was 30% of the people of Connecticut either participated in that parade or witnessed it. It had a theatrical celebration, and it was designed, a lot of it was celebrating that kind of Puritan historical tradition, but it also celebrated Connecticut's industrial greatness. It celebrated all of the ethnic diversity, all of the ethnic groups that had come to Connecticut during the great industrial explosion. were featured in the parades and highlighted. There was a big celebration there was such a big performance at the Bushnell Theater in downtown Hartford, which is I think it's the biggest stage in the city of Hartford for the performing arts. They had so many actors performing in this performance of celebration of Connecticut's history that they had to take over the state office buildings across the street and shuttle people back and forth across the stage to get them on. The stage manager must have had a nervous breakdown when it was over. Now, why I say this is quintessentially Connecticut, because in the midst of celebrating the inclusiveness of this entire state and its history and all the people there, they did not include in the stage performance either Native Americans or African Americans. And there's been this tendency in Connecticut to celebrate its past and talk about, how inclusive we are, but always it seems we have a secondary tendency to have some group or other that we leave out of the party. And it's not just a Connecticut thing. It's partially a human thing, and it's partially maybe an American thing. But our aspiration is to be, truly a united America that includes everyone. And I think Connecticut has tried from the beginning, and well, that's not true. Connecticut has been trying for a long time, and now we may get there.
I think that beautifully leads us into our next question. Is a difficult question. During this tumultuous time in America and across the globe, what will be the next defining moment that needs to be added to Connecticut or the general history books?
Wow. I think we're living in it right now. There is a confluence of some tremendously important problems and questions that have all come together at this moment in Connecticut history. People who are interested in history often wonder what it's like to live through it. Well, you're living through it. What we're in right now, it's never happened. There's never been a truly global pandemic before. The kind of economic problems that this pandemic has created are profoundly large, and they are going to be unique. And the questions of race and inclusion in this country that have emerged out of incidents that happen right now are, they are in some ways as old as the country, and they've been a struggle that we've tried to address. And I think they're demanding new treatment now. And I don't know what the evolution is going to be of all of these, but the next step is we're in it, and we're going to create the answers to those collectively. And unfortunately, we're doing it at a time when people on different sides of the political spectrum can hardly even stand to talk to each other. So we have to get over that. If we don't get over that, we're not, there isn't a workable future. So maybe the next important step is that we learn how to talk to each other again, and then we can work together to solve these really, really important problems that history has brought us to right now.
That's one of the aims of the museum holding programs like this, is to hear about these wonderful history topics and to learn from them, but to really increase our discussion and hopefully start these conversations.
Well, I'm very impressed with the questions. You have, your webinar participants are, they remind me of, kind of academic conferences where people ask the tough questions, but they're great. Thank you all.
That's us. We ask the hard questions in Westport.
Westport, the town of hard questions.
Our last question tonight is a bit more on the lighthearted side, and they are wondering, have you made an election cake, and is it truly the best cake?
there is a photograph of a beautiful, delicious election cake in my book that was made by my wife, Marie, and the photograph was taken by my wife, Marie, so she actually gets a credit in the book. And is my wife's election cake the most delicious election cake that has ever been made? Oh yes, absolutely. And is an election cake a delicious cake? Best you ever tasted. But don't take my word for it. Please write me at walt@uconn.edu, shortest address at the university, and I will send you the recipe for the election cake. You make one and then write me and tell me if I wasn't right that this is the best cake that has ever been made. How's that?
I think that was the correct answer. I think you'll be in the good graces of Marie this evening.
That's right. Yeah, if you've recorded that, please send it to me. I can use this.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening, Walter, and thank you all for being a part of our discussion. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our audience members with?
I just want to thank everyone for giving me the privilege of your time tonight. That's a really wonderful thing. I do appreciate it. I hope you have some interest in the book that I presented to you tonight. If you get a chance to read it, please, walt@uconn.edu, write and let me know what you think. And thank you so much. Have a good night.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.